So the first session today is we're going to have 3 speakers and then a bit of a panel. We're going to start that session with Emma Burns from the Australian Government's DSOPAC. And Emma is the, what are you, Emma? Assistant Director, Deputy Director of the Environmental Stewardship Program. And Emma's charged with ensuring the technical feasibility and appropriateness of the design of the Environmental Stewardship Program, which has only grown and has received additional allocations in the last budget and may have a role in some of the new money that's announced through the Clean Energy Future. So Emma is there working on making sure that we're using best evidence in those things, and she's going to talk to us about the past and future of the Environmental Stewardship Program. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you to Agnes for a lovely welcome to country as well. So I'm Emma Burns, and as Patrick said, I'm going to be talking about the Environmental Stewardship Program. That was a program that was announced in 2007 as a pilot program. And I wanted to start today by setting some of the context pre-2007 or in 2007, though it still resonates today. There was growing recognition within government that traditional approaches to grants were not necessarily efficient, not necessarily informed of costs per benefit, also not necessarily transparent or robust. Growing recognition that the allocation of funds on a short-term basis was probably not sufficient for the challenges at hand, and growing acceptance that the protection of biodiversity on private land was not adequate. And to illustrate that point, I've just used the example of temperate eucalypt woodlands, where 60% of what's estimated to remain occurs on private land. So within government, there was enough understanding and agreement that perhaps legislation and reservation alone were not sufficient tools for the biodiversity and NRM challenges, and that perhaps that there was a role for incentive programs and market-based approaches. So in mid-2007, under the Howard government, when Turnbull was minister, there was an announcement of a $50 million program, a pilot concept by the Australian government called the Environmental Stewardship Program. After a change of government and some efficiency dividends, that came down to $42.5 million over 4 years. What was really different about this, however, is that there was a contingency reserve. So that was a 4-year appropriation, but with contracts to land managers for 15 years. So it was a considerably larger investment, something in the order of about $140 million. Recently, in the new budget cycle, the program was renewed. The appropriation is approximately $84 million, though only half of that is new money, because we fund our existing contracts out of that appropriation as well. The program is governed by a strategic framework which is available on our website, and that articulates the program's objective and desired outcomes and our investment preferences, which I've put up here. The objective of the Environmental Stewardship Program is to maintain and improve condition and extent of targeted assets on private land or impacted by private land activities. And these assets have to be matters of national environmental significance listed under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. So when we're designing our approaches and our funding cycles, we have this very much at the forefront of our minds. That brings with it certain restrictions and challenges, but also opportunities. So the ultimate purpose and the pilot concept was for the Australian government to more cost-effectively provide the provision of public goods on private land and to address previously recognised market failures. And I have to acknowledge Jim for this schematic. But the Environmental Stewardship Program is an incentive and a financial incentive, but the way that it's been designed and delivered, it uses regulation and support and extension services as well. The Environmental Stewardship Program has funded a number of initiatives, including pre-existing initiatives, but the core business of the Environmental Stewardship section has been the design of two key projects. The first was the Grassy Woodlands project, and then soon after came the Multiple Ecological Communities project. And so this talk today is going to focus on that and the key lessons from doing those two projects. There were many design features that are common to the two initiatives. They both used reverse auctions. They both had long-term contracts with annual payments with land managers up to 15 years. They both had purpose-built metrics, although the first one was a modification of biometric, which is a New South Wales property vegetation planning metric. But they both had purpose-built state and transition models. So the first model was adapted from Sue McIntyre, the Laverell and McIntyre Grassy Woodland state and transition models. So we went about it. There were common features, but how we went about implementing it was quite different. In the design and the delivery of these projects, there has been capacity building, extension, compliance, and monitoring embedded in the design as well. I'm not going to go into too much detail today about the metrics, but I just have this simple schematic to try and explain the mechanism of a reverse auction. Essentially, there is a broad advertising campaign where we try to generate interest amongst private land managers and encourage them to express an interest to participate in the program after we've articulated what it is that we're interested in. So with our first project, it was the Grassy Woodlands. Land managers then request a site assessment and field officers go out. They have set methodology and they go to visit the land manager to determine the conservation value of what is on that land and to have a discussion with the land manager about what is required over the term of a contract with the Australian government. And we deliver through a third party on ground, which to date has mainly been through CMAs. So the role of the metric is to give us a conservation value score. This gives us a way of then taking the amount of money that a land manager wants and dividing the conservation value score to give us an index. We can then get a cumulative cost curve, and essentially we're trying to be informed of money spent per benefit gained. And you're either budget limited or you lose value for money when you get that hockey stick. For the first time last year, we were budget limited, which I'm sure most people in this room haven't experienced that. The Grassy Woodlands project ran out over 2007 to 2009, and it consisted of 5 individual tender rounds over 8 NRM regions and was implemented in Queensland and in New South Wales. These are some of the overarching results. You have a version of this presentation, and I've given more detailed slides at the back of the presentation that you can look at if you're interested. Essentially, in New South Wales, the program was very popular and we were oversubscribed. In Queensland, we were less successful. The land managers were a little bit more standoffish of the Australian government. At the end of the day, we contracted 201 land managers to manage over 26,000 hectares of land for periods of up to 15 years, and that has come at a cost of around $70 million over that 15 years. The Environmental Stewardship Program was reviewed last year, and the results of that review were predominantly focused on the Grassy Woodlands project, and the findings were mainly positive. So what have been some of the conservation gains? Well, having 201 land managers protecting and managing Grassy Woodlands is a given, and that there's lots of benefits in that. But there's been huge benefits in just increasing our understanding of what is on private land. And we have a monitoring project with ANU, and the results of that monitoring program are really positive as well. And most recently, we've discovered 2 new species of lizard, for example. So in terms of mapping and GIS capability, just the government understanding exactly where these assets are and and in what condition, which when it comes to our data sets, what condition things are in is really not well understood. But there is still so much to do. So for anyone, which often happens, to suggest that there's been sufficient investment in boxelm grassy woodlands, I would say that would be an odd conclusion, because we've only captured less than 3% of what we estimate to be there. So from being within the program, what have been some of the key lessons? Well, very early on, we realised that this was really quite knowledge-intensive and skills-dependent mechanism, and that if you were going to target each individual asset or matter of NES under the EPBC Act, it would be quite an expensive way to go about it. We're also aware that the design and getting land managers to manage these critically endangered remnants was really not valuing the paddock trees, for example, things that can occur in adjoining land, and it wasn't informed of the threats that can come from that, from the matrix or the agri-matrix. We realised really early that the state in transition concept was really well received by land managers in particular, but also by senior bureaucrats. It was a good way to try and to communicate. The way that the state in transition model was used in the boxelm grassy woodlands project was it was predominantly based on management history, so a very quick judgment by field officers, and then a longer assessment of ecological condition. But we found a really strong relationship between those two things. So something that took a field officer 5 minutes versus something that took a field officer half an hour gave you the same result at the end of the day, which was an interesting finding. The CSIRO, after the end of round 4 of the boxelm grassy woodlands project, reviewed metric performance and field implementation, and we found that the design was quite sensitive to varying skill sets on ground with our field officers. And we were already aware that biometric wasn't purpose-built for MBIs, so it wasn't a relative metric. So there was plenty of space for us to innovate and improve on what we were doing. And this was coupled with growing literature and growing recognition that we should be doing more to manage adjoining land next to these remnants and to protect paddock trees, for example, and to address that looming extinction. The end result was the Multiple Ecological Communities project, which was first implemented last year. We've only had one implementation round. It ran out across 5 NRMs in both South Australia and New South Wales. The first obvious difference is that we bundled the assets, so we targeted 5 ecological communities. But beyond that, what we did is we offered management options to land managers in the land adjoining for buffering and connectivity benefit. And we were also informed of our value judgments of what threats were present and what impact that might have on the remnant, given the management that the land manager is willing to do. We teamed up with the CSIRO to develop our metric and our field implementation approach, and that's been a very challenging and stimulating relationship, which I've enjoyed very much. We gave them a pretty tight brief. We wanted our metric and our approach to be informed of Australian government processes and to as much of a degree as we could to be able to align to previous work that the department had done, especially with listing advices and existing condition classes, so that, for example, we could say a state 1 condition is comparable to a condition class A in the listing. Now, that wasn't always possible because how we've gone around listing ecological communities hasn't been consistent, but that was generally what we were trying to achieve. We wanted to be more informed of the probability of success, so not just how many actions will this land manager do, but given the context, how likely is it that this would be successful? At the core of the conceptual design of the project and the metric are state and transition models. So we commissioned ecological, and CSIRO tweaked the resulting state and transition models, that essentially we came up with ways of trying to describe condition classes, and they're informed of the ecological variables but also the management history. But ask me questions later, and I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail. The resulting metric, which we call the conservation value measure and generates the conservation value score, was essentially based on the probability of an end condition in 15 years. The strongest influences in the metric are the things up here that you can see, where the site 15 score is multiplied by area, by duration, so is it a 10-year contract or a 15-year contract or something in between, and security, so are they offering a covenant to give us longer term security and outcomes or not. This Site 15 score, or part of the metric, is informed of its current condition and what threats are present, and if the land manager is choosing to abate those threats. So is it likely to actually go down in condition despite best efforts? Or is it going to go up in condition, or is it going to maintain condition? And remember, the objective of the program is to maintain and improve, so it aligns with those desires. So in the end, the conservation or the metric has many roles, and one of those important roles is the data collection system. The role of the field officer is to collect the data to put into the tool that was developed. And the most important role is to communicate the intent and the purpose of the program and what it is that we're trying to achieve and what management is appropriate given the context. The metric helps inform that discussion, but at the end of the day, we're very much dependent on the field officers to have this conversation on our behalf and to encourage the land managers to participate, but only if they're comfortable. Otherwise, it's a risk to the investment if they're not comfortable and if they don't understand what it is that is required and if they haven't costed their bid. Okay, thanks. Here are some of the overarching results from the first round of implementation of the Multiple Ecological Communities project. You have copies of this, so I'm not going to go into it in detail. Essentially, it resulted in a little over 21,000 hectares being managed, and over the 15 years, it's over $60 million worth of investment. I also have additional information slides which give you a breakdown of the condition classes and where they are at the back of the talk. So how did the conceptual approach work? And I'll skim over this and I can talk to you in more detail later if you're interested. Essentially, given the time frame that it was developed in, it worked pretty well. There were variations in costs which we anticipated, but they were actually more uniform than I thought that they would be, based on different opportunity costs for different ecological communities and different landscapes. Generally speaking, sites were larger in New South Wales than South Australia, and that is something that we anticipated, and buffering areas were larger in New South Wales than in South Australia, which was something that was also anticipated. In terms of giving us the predicted hockey stick, it worked well. It gave us good spread and enough choice between bids, and the evaluation panel who decides and uses this process to inform their funding decisions had a lot of faith in the process and stuck to it really well, which was a great sign of success from my viewpoint. I think one of the most interesting outcomes is that buffering, despite a lot of trepidation from people when we proposed this design, was successful. Land managers adopted it when offered, and the costs were really quite marginal. And hopefully the conservation gains will be there. And that in itself is one of the exciting opportunities to be able to compare buffered versus non-buffered sites and the amount of change. So what have been the key lessons so far? Well, we're still learning them. But it's still an intensive design and it still has limited market potential, but you're always going to get that if you go after the most critically endangered thing in the landscape. The metric and the state and transition models performed well, and from my perspective, I thought it was an improvement on the Boxholm Grassy Woodlands project. Land managers are willing to do beyond patch actions and at little cost. It is extremely difficult to communicate technical information to government officers, to land managers, essentially to most people. And if we can just come up with simplified ways of communicating complicated concepts, I think we'll be more successful. The design still has some sensitivity to loss of integrity through implementation, though we've only had one round of implementation, and that just gives us lots to focus on in terms of training. Connectivity and the concept of connectivity and how the threat of isolation was assessed was particularly challenging, and that will need to be a focus of any sort of future rounds. Developing generalised management actions is also extremely challenging and difficult, and it's a very contentious issue. People are very passionate about it, but when you go to try and find some evidence to support people's passions, it's usually not there. At the end of, or during the implementation of this, we did a semi-structured phone interviews with land managers, which was a wonderful exercise. So instead of being told what land managers think all the time, we could actually find out for ourselves. Generally, the land managers were really positive. They appreciated the challenges, but they don't like being told how to do their business. They're daunted by costing, let alone costing over a 15-year period. And interestingly, they wanted more direct contact because we deliver through our delivery agents on ground. They wanted more direct contact with the Environmental Stewardship Program staff. These lessons are from many people that have been involved in the program since 2007, and especially those that informed the conceptual design. And I just wanted to acknowledge those people. And as for the last bit of the talk, which is essentially what's next, it's very interesting times, and with the recent announcements around the clean energy futures, I'm still trying to figure it out for myself. But we need to learn and adapt. We need to establish monitoring processes, adequate ones, and support our existing land managers. I think the most valuable asset that we have is our land managers. We're about to have 270 of them, and we need to support them. We need to build on what we have achieved. We're under increasing pressure to scale up, and I'm very mindful that informed simplicity can turn into outright stupidity very quickly. So that's something for us to be mindful of. We need to adapt to emerging NRM and carbon policies. So I'll be listening intently to Eliza when she talks next. And in terms of future design intent, we intend to go after multiple species listed under the EPBC Act next, and trying to get more efficiencies and a generalised model that hopefully we can stick to and not have mass reinventions each time. I just wanted to end with some of the quotes from our land managers who are really quite insightful and we could learn a lot from. And if we have a forum like this again, it would be wonderful to invite some of those land managers. So I won't read them out, but one of my favourites is, "I like stewardship more than crutching sheep."